The evening, as usual, began with the usual chores: the sounds of dishes, the squeak of a chair, the faint smell of coffee I had made in the morning but never finished. Thoughts tangled just as my gaze did, fixed on the window and the dark streets outside. The silence in the house felt strange, empty. From time to time, I would raise my eyes, almost hoping that something would change, that something would awaken in this cold space. But nothing happened. I could hear my husband's footsteps from the stairs, his voice already blending with the hum of the cars outside. James had always been like this, absorbed in work, tired, barely able to escape the embrace of the day's hustle. He entered, nodded in my direction, and immediately headed for the kitchen. It was a moment when it felt like we were living separate lives, divided by an invisible wall. He didn't notice when I looked at the clock again, didn't notice that I was waiting. "Hello, darling," I said, though I knew that this word had lost all its warmth. He only nodded without taking off his jacket and continued preparing for a meeting with papers, as always. An hour, two. I tried to say something, and he answered without looking up, only with brief phrases. When I mentioned that today was our anniversary, he didn't even react. His face didn't change. Only quietly, almost mechanically, he said, "I have a lot of work, I can't right now." These were his words, his habit, his excuse for everything. I felt something snap inside me. My heart froze for a moment, and my voice suddenly became quieter. James and I hadn't argued in a long time. We had simply forgotten what it was like to be close. Each of us was building our own world, and at its center, for him, was work. And for me, it was loneliness. How long had it been since this started? A month? A year? Or longer? I couldn't remember exactly. At that moment, I realized that for him, I had become just the background of his life, the background that didn't require any attention. And that, perhaps, was the most painful part. Realizing that for the one you love, you're simply a part of the usual routine, unnoticed against the backdrop of everyday tasks. I took my cup of coffee, set it down on the table, but not waiting for an answer to my thoughts, went to the bedroom. I no longer wanted to be part of this day. The night air in the house was cold, and I kept trying to warm up, but nothing helped. Everything remained just as empty. When I was about to retreat to my room, the doorbell rang. I was surprised, as it was strange to expect guests at this late hour. When I opened the door, I saw Robert, my old friend, whom I hadn't seen in many years. He was standing there with a suitcase in his hands, smiling, as if those long years of separation had never existed. "Hello, can I come in?" His voice was warm and confident, and suddenly I realized how much I had missed it. I stepped back, letting him into the house, and he immediately stood in the hallway as if he had just been here. Rob and I used to spend a lot of time together, but our lives drifted apart, and I hadn't even noticed exactly when that had happened. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing how I suddenly froze. I couldn't find an answer right away, and then, clearing my throat, I said, "Yes. I just didn't expect a visit." He took off his jacket and looked around. Something about his presence felt alive. I tried to remember the last time I had felt such ease in talking with someone. At that moment, James was sitting silently in his room. He didn't say a word when Rob entered. Apparently, for him, it was as natural as if Rob had always been part of this house. "You mentioned you needed a place to stay?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation. "Yeah, I'll stay with you for a couple of weeks, if that's all right." Rob smiled. "I don't like hotel life, and this place seems peaceful." I nodded, not quite sure how it would affect the atmosphere in the house. Rob had always been a special person. It was never boring with him, and he could bring life to any place. But to be honest, I didn't know what I needed right now. New conversations or silence. Rob stayed, and with each passing day, I began to feel that this wasn't a coincidence, that his return to my life was changing something. Dinner with Rob became an unexpected event in our routine life. Everything in the house was as usual: the cool air, the dim lighting, and from the kitchen came the sound of dishes I had recently laid out on the table. But now, I didn't feel that familiar loneliness that had been with me for the past few months. Rob was sitting across from me, and his words seemed to fill the emptiness I had learned to ignore. We laughed at trivial things, discussed books, movies, and old memories. Rob told me about his travels, about how he had finally decided to break free from the routine and wander the world. But I felt that within this light conversation, there was something more. Rob, with his sincere questions and attention, seemed to see me in a way I couldn't be noticed by James. His gaze wasn't distant. His words weren't dry and businesslike like my husband's. He was alive. Here? Now. It was so unlike my world, where everything turned into familiar and lifeless phrases that no one paid much attention to. James sat in the corner, his gaze never leaving me, but he remained silent. He didn't join in the conversation as if he preferred to stay outside of this friendly exchange. His face was tense, and if a smile appeared, it was only for a moment, almost casually. I felt how his silence became noticeable. I knew that he wasn't comfortable with the situation. And honestly, I didn't know what to do about it. We hadn't talked in a long time, and now, in this dark corner of our lives, a new person had appeared, filling the space with laughter and light. With each word from Rob, I felt more and more how he held my attention, how his presence became something important, something I hadn't allowed myself before. I noticed how deftly he steered the conversation away from tense moments and how easily we exchanged thoughts, as if nothing stood between us. James continued to sit silently. I couldn't help but notice how he looked at me more and more often, then turned away. He didn't intervene in the conversation, but his silent observation was becoming burdensome. At that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that between us, there was really nothing left but silence. I tried not to think about it, but in my mind, questions kept swirling, questions I couldn't find answers to. Why didn't he, James, ask me how I was feeling? Why was he silent when there was so much to say? Maybe it was the end of something, or maybe the beginning of something new. After dinner, I was left alone in the kitchen, reflecting on what had just happened. Rob and James had already gone to their rooms. I heard Rob quietly enter the hallway, but I didn't pay much attention until he reappeared, at the kitchen doorway. There was no tension or expectation in his eyes. He just stood there with a light smile, asking if I needed help. I couldn't refuse. His offer sounded as if he genuinely wanted to help, not just avoid an awkward moment. "Would you like some more tea?" Rob asked, approaching the shelf with cups. I nodded, feeling how his calmness relaxed me. It was strange, since we hadn't talked this openly and often before, but now, in this moment, I didn't want to distance myself. I noticed how attentively he listened, how he radiated a calmness that had long since disappeared from my home. We sat down at the table, and he started talking about books. It was as if we were on the same wavelength again, like we were old friends once more. It turned out our tastes in literature matched, and I suddenly realized how much I had missed this. The simple, genuine interest in what I had to say. Rob talked about his favorite authors, and I unexpectedly found myself thinking that I couldn't remember the last time I discussed books with someone for so long. You know, it's so great to forget. How it feels when you just talk. You don't think about what you'll say. You're not worried about what the other person will say, he said. And I felt how his words made me relax. The laughter in his voice, the calm with which he listened. It all seemed to pull me out of the usual closed-off circle. I couldn't understand what was happening inside me. Rob was a friend, an old friend, and everything seemed to remain just friendship between us. But the moment he looked at me and smiled, something inside me suddenly stirred. I couldn't explain it, but I understood that in his presence I felt alive. Not the way I was before, but alive in the sense that I hadn't been forgotten, that I was still seen. At some point, we both fell silent, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was light, like the quiet evening surrounding us. I felt how all the tension inside me disappeared. It was simply nice to be with him, to talk about things I hadn't talked about in a long time. He didn't rush me. didn't try to pry anything out of me. He was just there. "Thanks for the company," I finally said. It was a simple, but at the same time meaningful acknowledgement. He smiled but didn't answer, and I felt how I wanted to continue this conversation. When Rob stood up to leave the kitchen, he looked back and said, "If you need to talk, I'm here." And perhaps those words were exactly what I had been waiting for. The next day, I woke up with a strange sense of lightness, as though I had woken up in another world. Everything around me was the same. Shadows on the walls, the morning sun, the dents on the sofa. But something inside me had changed. I kept thinking about Rob, about how he sat next to me, how his voice soothed me, how I laughed with him as if it were a long-forgotten feeling that had returned at the most unexpected moment. The familiar silence once again ruled our house. James had left for work as usual, with a tired look and hurried steps. He didn't even notice when I smiled, thinking about my conversation with Rob. For some reason, I felt like I couldn't let go of these thoughts entirely. They became persistent, like shadows that won't disappear, no matter how hard you try to ignore them. His smile, his calmness, his attention. All of it felt more real than the empty evenings I spent with James, waiting for even the smallest sign that he noticed me. I found myself more and more often mentally returning to those moments when Rob looked at me, when his voice caressed my ears, when I felt so easy and warm next to him. It all swirled in my head uneasily, like a whirlwind that wouldn't let go. I didn't like this feeling. I couldn't allow myself to think of Rob in the way I shouldn't. He was a friend. We were just friends. But there wasn't a day that went by when I didn't remember his face, his words. One day, when I was home alone, I noticed how often my gaze drifted towards his room. He was there, he was nearby, and I couldn't escape it. Rob had never been pushy, never crossed the boundaries of our communication, but with each passing day, his presence became something subtly important to me. When he quietly entered the kitchen to offer me a cup of tea, I felt drawn to him. I tried again to push that thought away, as if I could ignore it. But it stayed. Suddenly, I realized that I was starting to wait for him. He was becoming a part of my day, a part of my thoughts, and I couldn't handle it. But there was also something else. I could feel myself pulling away from James. Not physically, but emotionally. He continued to live his life, absorbed in his work, while I sank deeper into thoughts of Rob. I tried to justify my feelings, telling myself that none of this mattered. But the more I tried to convince myself, the clearer it became that it did matter. I could feel my heart waver between two worlds, the world of familiar loneliness with James and the world of unexpected warmth that Rob gave me. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger my desire grew to find an answer to the question of what I was really feeling. The next morning, when I woke up, I noticed how everything in the house had changed. James had returned earlier than usual. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, staring out the window, not noticing me. There was no sign of the usual tiredness in his gaze as there had been before, but instead, there was some kind of emptiness, as if he sensed that something had changed. I couldn't figure out exactly what, but the tension in the air had become palpable. "You've changed," he suddenly said, without any preamble, as if he already knew I wouldn't have an answer. "You're not the same as before, and it's bothering me." I tried to smile, but it didn't work. I knew he was right. Things were indeed different, and I couldn't explain what was happening. I looked at him, but couldn't find the strength to respond. He was my husband, and we had been together for so long. But something had gone wrong, and I couldn't pinpoint when it happened. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I probably already knew the answer. I tried to justify myself, but the words wouldn't come. He stood up and began pacing the room, avoiding my gaze. I felt his eyes sliding over me as if he were trying to find something hidden. "You're starting to pull away from me," he continued, his voice quiet but desperate. "You don't even tell me how your day went anymore. You stopped telling me what you think. It's like you don't want me around. This isn't like you." I felt his words cut through me like a knife. I couldn't say anything in response because I didn't know what was really happening. He kept looking at me, trying to find something in my eyes that could explain his suspicions. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm trying, but you keep slipping away. Tell me what's going on." I couldn't respond. Everything I was feeling was too complicated for words. I knew I couldn't keep hiding my thoughts, but at the same time, I was scared to admit what was happening. Everything I felt, everything that was between us, I couldn't ignore it anymore. But the words wouldn't come. "I don't know what to say," I said. And that was all I could say. James silently looked at me, then grabbed his bag and quietly left the room. He left me alone in the silence, and I felt everything inside me tear apart. I couldn't understand what I was supposed to do. The emotions I was going through were too strong and tangled. I couldn't tell him the truth because I didn't even know what exactly I was feeling. He left, and the silence returned to the house. But now it was different. Heavier, more tangible. I didn't know what would come next, but I understood that this conversation had changed everything. That evening was different. Rob came back home after work, and at some point, I felt his presence before I even saw him. He was standing in the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel, and when he noticed me, he smiled. I noticed that his gaze was a little softer than usual. Maybe it was because he sensed that something had happened, or maybe it was just his way of keeping the conversation going. But something had changed. We didn't talk about what had happened with James, but I felt a connection growing between us, barely perceptible, yet so strong that I couldn't ignore it. Rob continued talking about his plans, doing everything he could to avoid bringing up the topic that might make the atmosphere awkward. It was as if he instinctively knew that I needed time to sort out my feelings. At some point, when I was standing by the window and Rob was preparing something in the kitchen, he came up to me and said, "Do you want to talk?" It was so simple, but in that moment, I realized how his words calmed me. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask what was going on in my life. He simply offered his company as though he knew I needed it. I turned to him and, without thinking, exhaled. "I don't know what's going on. I'm confused." He didn't lecture me. He didn't start asking about James. He simply listened. And that was amazing because I could feel how his attention on me, his presence, became something important, something I couldn't explain. It was so simple, just being there and feeling understood without any pressure, without trying to make me open up. We stayed silent for a long time. And I didn't feel the tension that had been hanging over the past few weeks. Rob didn't try to make me say more than I could. He was just there, and it was comforting. With each word I spoke, it became harder to ignore what I was feeling. I knew I couldn't continue as I had before. I felt something shifting inside me. Rob didn't overstep, didn't cross boundaries, but his attention, his ease of communication made me think. I could no longer say that I felt nothing, that everything was fine. That was far from the truth. We sat in silence, and I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept racing, not letting me rest. Rob appeared calm, but I could see he too felt some tension. He didn't ask, but I knew he cared. And that was strange. That was exactly what I had been missing. No matter how hard I tried to ignore my feelings, I couldn't do it. I was at a crossroads, and in that moment, sitting next to Rob, I realized that I didn't know where to go next. James came back late, as usual, but the atmosphere in the house was different. We both stayed silent, and I felt how heavy each glance exchanged between us had become. It was as if he sensed that something had changed, but didn't know exactly what. He silently took off his jacket and hung it on the coat rack without saying a word. I noticed how he looked at me, as if waiting for a response, but I couldn't give him one. Everything was too complicated. I tried to act as usual, but as often happens in such situations, my usual behavior became unfamiliar. I felt like James was observing every step I took, as if his gaze was scrutinizing every movement I made. I couldn't understand what he saw in my gestures and facial expressions, but the feeling was so strong that I even wondered if he suspected something. He sat down on the couch, his gaze sharp and piercing, and I felt as if this gaze was tearing away everything I was trying to hide. He didn't ask directly what was going on, but his silence held a question. I felt that his silence was of the kind that left little room for any excuses. I couldn't decide what to do. Thoughts about Rob raced through my mind again. His calmness, the attention he gave me, his presence that had become so important to me. It was impossible to ignore, and I knew that James could sense it. He spoke, but his words were cautious, as if he didn't want to fully reveal his suspicions. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but insistent. "Something's not right." I felt everything inside me tighten. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't explain why Rob had become so important to me. I couldn't explain why, in his presence, I felt alive, when in James's world, I had long since withered away. "No, everything's fine," I replied, but those words felt hollow because I already knew he didn't believe them. And I didn't believe them either. James fell silent again. His eyes remained fixed on me, and I felt as though his gaze was probing, trying to pull out answers that I couldn't give. But he didn't say anything more. He just sat there, in his room, and everything was as it had always been. But this time, everything felt impossible. The silence between us was unbearable. I tried to hide my feelings, but it was getting harder. I couldn't keep living the way I had before, but I couldn't figure out how to take the first step. The next morning, the house was once again filled with silence, but this time, it was different. James had left as usual, without a word, leaving me alone. At some point, I felt how the house had become emptier than ever, even with Rob's presence. He was there, but it wasn't enough to drown out the feeling of something that had long since left. Rob appeared again in the kitchen. I noticed how quickly he entered, but he didn't say anything unnecessary. He immediately went to the window and looked outside, as if trying to retreat into his own thoughts. I knew his silence wasn't accidental. We both felt how the space around us had changed. "How are you?" he asked, not turning towards me. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern in it. He wasn't looking for details. He wasn't asking unnecessary questions, just showing interest. I didn't know how to answer. The words got stuck in my throat. I tried to find the right response, but I couldn't. There were no simple words, no simple solutions. I'm not sure," I said, feeling how hard it was to let that answer out. "I need to figure things out. About what I'm feeling." Rob was silent, but he didn't leave the kitchen. It was as if he understood that I wasn't ready to say more. He sat at the table, sipping his coffee, continuing to look at me, but there was no judgment in his gaze. He was simply there. And this was the moment I had been waiting for, understanding without pressure. "You don't have to explain everything," Rob finally said, his voice soft. "You know I'm always here if you want to talk." I felt how there was lightness and support in his words. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't trying to pry answers from me. He was just staying with me. That was so important to me at that moment. I didn't have to explain everything. I didn't have to justify myself. It was simply safe to be near him. He was a friend, and that was what I had been looking for. At some point, I realized that Rob had become more than just a friend, but some kind of bridge between me and the world I was trying to leave behind. I couldn't help but feel that his presence somehow filled me with energy I had long since lost. His words, his attention, all of it seemed to fill the emptiness I could no longer ignore. We sat in silence, but I didn't want this moment to end. I felt how his words and his silence filled the space around me. And in that moment, I realized that perhaps I could no longer stay in the place where everything had frozen. James came home late, as usual. This evening was different from the others. His presence felt tense, as if he was still holding inside the same unspoken pain that I was. I sat on the couch, and he stood by the door, taking off his coat, but his gaze was fixed directly on me. I knew he felt something, but all he did was remain silent. You're silent again, I said, unable to hold it in. The words came out before I could stop them. This silence had become oppressive, and it was getting harder to endure. He looked at me but didn't respond right away. I saw how his eyes narrowed and his lips barely moved. The silence had become unbearable to me, and I felt how his wariness was slowly turning into detachment. He was in the house, but it was as if he wasn't really there. Do you want something? His voice was low and tired. I noticed how his words seemed to cut through everything I had tried to build during these few days when we hadn't yet lived in silence. I don't know what you want from me, I said, trying to understand what was happening. Thoughts of Rob flashed through my mind again, and it was terrifying. Everything had become too tangled to explain with simple words. I couldn't understand why this soulless wall had once again appeared between us. James, of course, noticed my glances, but all he did was shrug. He was in his world, and nothing could pull him out of that closed circle. I felt the space between us growing smaller. In his silence, I could clearly read that he no longer cared. You can't keep silent like this for so long, he finally said. His words carried a slight reproach, but they still didn't break through the fog we had created between us. It was as if he had gotten stuck in a pause where no one could answer. I turned towards him, feeling the lump of emotions tighten in my chest. I couldn't convince him of anything anymore. All I could do was let go of his silence because I understood. There was no future in it. He stood there like a stone wall, and I, realizing that I could no longer live the way I had before, decided to take a step forward. But I was scared. Scared to admit that I had long since stopped feeling connected to him. Scared to leave what had once been familiar, even though it had become empty and lifeless. James remained silent. And I understood that this silence was the end of what we once called a relationship. The next few days felt like a dream. I would wake up as if from a fog, trying to gather my thoughts, but they would slip away from me like shadows that can't be caught. Every moment, every step in the house reminded me that I couldn't continue the way things had been before. It was too obvious, too oppressive. Something was irreversibly changing, and I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. James continued to act as if nothing had happened. He would come home, stay silent, leave in the morning. But between us remained this invisible wall. We no longer pretended that everything was okay. We both knew that something was breaking, but neither of us dared admit that it was the end. I couldn't stop thinking about Rob. Even when I tried to focus on something else, his face, his calm presence, would return to me. He didn't demand explanations from me, didn't try to fix or guide me. He simply was there when I needed him. His friendship, his attention were becoming important to me. And despite all my internal conflict, I couldn't ignore how I felt. I felt how his presence filled the emptiness that had formed between me and James. I sat alone in the room, thinking about everything that had happened. Every step, every decision felt heavy, as if I were standing on the edge, ready to make a choice that would change everything. But no matter what choice I made, I knew it would no longer be the same. I couldn't go back to the life I had with James. I realized that it would never be the same again. At that moment, I understood. I had to change something. I could no longer stay in the shadow of this silence and alienation. I had to make the decision, the step that was necessary, despite all the difficulty and fear. When Rob came up to me again to talk, I realized that this was the moment to make a decision. He didn't ask me what I wanted. He didn't try to make me choose between him and James. He was simply there, listening as I began to speak. I don't know what to do, I said, and it was a pure admission. But I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep lying to myself and everyone. Rob looked at me with understanding, but without pressure. He didn't say anything unnecessary. His silence felt like support, like an unspoken promise that no matter what I decided, he would be there. At that moment, I realized that I was facing a choice that had no right or wrong answer, but I had to make it for myself. I had to understand what I truly wanted, what I needed to be happy. There was no answer that came easily, but I knew one thing. I needed to move forward. The silence of James and my own feelings could no longer be ignored. This was the beginning of a new path, even if I didn't know what it would bring. And perhaps it was right now that I began to understand that choice is not an end, but the beginning of something else.